Hello everybody, my name is Florian Guida and I'm working for IFO and Dalival as a variety project manager.
Hello everybody, I'm Frédéric Bernard, manager of IFO, and we are very glad to introduce to you the new variety Canopy. I will first present you the story of Canopy. IFO company was created in 2004. Since its very beginning, one of the objectives of our apple breeding program was to create a new green variety to be an alternative to Granny Smith and having the scab-resistant gene RVI6. In addition, the target was also to create a variety that was also as green as Granny Smith and remains green after storage. And finally, that is not more sensitive to pink blush development. So Canopy was born by a cross carried out in 2004. The seedlings from those pips were inoculated by scab to discard all the ones that were not resistant to scab. We finally obtained 166 different hybrids planted for the first step and evaluated for 4 to 5 years in the orchard. In the next step, which is called the level 1, only 5 candidates were remaining and we planted 4 trees of each. Those candidates were evaluated again for 4 to 5 years. And finally, the last stage, called level 2, was planted only with 1 candidate, which is Canopy, that was still performing very well in the orchard and confirming its interest as an alternative to Granny Smith. In the end, it took almost 20 years to create Canopy, from the crossing to the decision to launch it on the market and to test it in many European countries. These European trials have confirmed the potential of Canopy across the continent. In terms of appearance, you can see on the pictures that Canopy looks very similar to Granny Smith. Sometimes, depending on the climatic conditions, Canopy can develop some lenticels with resetting. In terms of eating qualities, the taste profile of Canopy is dominantly acidic. The observations carried out by the French experimental station of La Morinière show that the level of acidity of Canopy is very similar to the one of Granny Smith. In terms of Brix index, which represents the sugar level, Canopy is slightly sweeter than Granny Smith, and the bigger difference is due to the higher firmness of Canopy compared to Granny Smith. On the second picture, we show the results from testing sessions held at IFO on an unexperienced test panel of consumers. The trends are comparable to the measurements from La Morinière, with the same level of acidity, but a higher sweetness and a higher firmness for Canopy. Finally, the texture, the juiciness, and the intensity of the aroma are all higher for Canopy compared to Granny Smith. We can then conclude that Granny Smith consumers will also appreciate Canopy. I now give the floor to Florian Guida, who will present the agronomic performance of Canopy.
Thanks, Frédéric, for your presentation. Now you've seen that Canopy and Granny Smith are very similar in terms of fruits. Let's see what makes Canopy special on a grower perspective. Let's start with the tree shape. Every grower knows how it's difficult to properly manage a Granny Smith tree with big branches, blindwood issues. You can see a diagram of a Granny Smith tree on the right side of this diagram. Canopy is more similar to Gala and Golden Rinder with many balanced fruiting branches and no blindwood issues, as you can see on the left of the diagram. So this makes Canopy easier to grow and more productive because you have more fruiting branches. The second strength of Canopy is its tolerance to pests and diseases. Genetically speaking, Canopy has resistance to scab with the RVI6 gene and tolerance to rosy aphids with the gene DPFL-LG8. So you could say that it's a good start, but how it's performing in the orchard? To answer these questions, so we sent a survey to the research stations trialing Canopy in Europe. Here on this map, you can see the station which sent us their feedback. We divided them into 3 categories for each pest and disease which have been evaluated, starting with scab, then rosy aphids, European cankers, and powdery mildews. The first category represents the stations which have found canopy more susceptible to these diseases than Granny Smith. The second category is for the stations which found the same level of susceptibility. And the third category is for the stations which found canopy less susceptible than Granny Smith. So let's see the results, starting with scab. So 88% of the stations have found canopy less susceptible to scab than Granny Smith. It's not that surprising given the gene of resistance we have on canopy, but it's still a very positive result. Now, if we look on rosy aphids, European cankers, and powdery mildews, we also have very good results because at least half of the stations have found a canopy and Granny Smith with the same susceptibility. But even more interesting is that many of them find canopy less susceptible than Granny Smith to these diseases. So it's quite positive overall, and we can say that in most of cases, canopy is performing similar or better than Granny Smith for the main pests and diseases we evaluated. Since canopy is a green variety, you could imagine to use it as a pollinator. In terms of genetic compatibility, canopy carries the same S allele gene which make Granny Smith a good pollinator. So we are talking about S23. So as Granny Smith is compatible with most of the commercial variety, it is also the case for canopy. In terms of pollination period, so canopy blooms at the same period as Granny Smith and within the same range of dates. So we have evaluated it on the European network I've just presented before. Since we have these good 2 parameters, we also wanted to evaluate the potential of pollination on site. So we did some trials at the IFO research station. A pollination trial is very easy. So you pollinate manually several flowers, and then you count how many fruits you obtain from these flowers. In our trial, we pollinated 15 flowers per repetition. And here on this diagram, you can see the number of fruits we have obtained from these flowers. Overall, the conclusion is that canopy and Granny Smith have the same pollination potential just because we have obtained roughly the same number of fruits, even if you see minor difference, for example, on gala, the number of fruits is very limited. So canopy seems to be quite a good pollination option, especially if you're working with scab resistant blocks where canopy will express its full potential. We can't finish without talking about harvest and storage potential. So in terms of harvest dates, we have observed that canopy can be harvested 1 week later than Granny Smith if you want to have the same starch degradation. In terms of storage potential, so several years of evaluation in partnership with the CTFL La Morinière didn't show any difference between canopy and Granny Smith, especially on scald susceptibility. So same storage potential, same susceptibility to scald between Granny Smith and canopy. Then a very important point to be mentioned is that canopy is maintaining the green coloration you have at harvest during its storage. Before we conclude, we want to give the floor to the La Morinière station, and Ségolène Dandin will share her experience on the potential of canopy.
Hello everybody, I'm Ségolène Dandin. I work at CTFL La Morinière in France, in Loire-Vallée, and I will present you my experience on canopy. I will present you the synthesis of 3 years of observation in CTFL La Morinière. So about harvest data, we can see on the first graph that we have trees on a conventional orchard and we have trees on organic orchard. For the both, we have on cumulated higher production for canopy than for challenger. On the second graph, we can see that sizing for organic orchard. And we can see the same graph for conventional orchard. On this graph, we can see on the cumulative that we have smaller fruits for canopy than for challenger. We also can see that we have 20% fruits too big on challenger. And we can see on the cumulative for canopy that we have 20% fruits too small. We can see that the yield for canopy is higher than for challenger because we have more fruits. About susceptibility, we can see that like in the European results, we have the same result on La Morinière in Loire Valley. We can see also that we have a reset on the apples of canopy. In the organic orchard, it's due to the application of copper on our organic program, which induce these marks. On this slide, we can see that the maturity of canopy is later than challenger. On the first graph, we can see the stars regression. The one color is 1 year of production and is one orchard. So in 2021 and 2022, the two first years of production, we harvest challenger and canopy at the same date. And we can see that for the same date, we have a difference of 1 point or 2 points of stars regression. In 2023, we try to harvest challenger and canopy at the same stars regression. So we have about 10 days of difference between the two varieties in conventional orchard and in organic orchard. About sugar level, we can see that we always have sugar level higher for canopy than for challenger in organic orchard and in conventional orchard. Even if we have more production with canopy and than with the challenger. About the scab, we have done trials in pre-harvest scab. In 2021, we didn't see difference between canopy and challenger, and in 2022, we didn't see scab on the both varieties. We will done trial in 2023 with the new harvest. So canopy seems to be a good alternative to challenger in our condition. With this 3 years of observation, and we will continue this observation in La Morinière.
Thanks, Ségolène, for this very positive feedback. So to conclude with, canopy is an apple for Granny Smith consumers. It's an easy-to-grow variety with good tolerances to diseases, and it's a good alternative as a pollinator. So definitely, canopy is the scab-resistant apple that challenges Granny Smith, no matter if it's in full block or as a pollinator, as an organic or as a conventional variety. We are sure that it will fit your orchard, and we are now at your disposal to answer any of your questions.